Melchizedek is mentioned in other chapters, but we'll focus our attention on these verses. The book of Hebrews is often said to distort the Old Testament when it quotes it, twists things around, gets them wrong. Listen to what the text says. This is serious exegesis. It is reading what is there in the text. This Melchizedek was king of Salem. Well, those are the facts. That's what the text says. And priest of God Most High. Well, that's what Genesis 14 says. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. That's what the text says. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now you start getting the exegesis. That's just the summary of the text. Now the exegesis. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. That works in Hebrew. So although this is written by a Greek-speaking writer with remarkable flourish, we can't be sure who the author is, nevertheless, he thinks that the Hebrew name is important. It is theologically significant. And he knows that in Hebrew, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and he spells it out. Then also he is king of Salem. That's what the text says, which means king of peace. Without father or mother, so far as the text goes, without genealogy, that's the point, without beginning of days or end of life, so far as the text goes, he is like the Son of God. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, of course, if he really is the Son of God, he remains a priest forever because he is the eternal Son of God. But what the author is saying is there is theological weight, theological significance in what is left out. Now, arguments of silence can be very weak. But an argument for silence is very strong if you're expecting noise. Read Sherlock Holmes. The dog that barked in the night. The point is the dog didn't bark in the night. This dog always barks where there's a stranger around. Somebody came in and did something in the house. The dog didn't bark. The silence is significant because this dog always barks where there are strangers. Therefore, it had to be somebody who was known to the dog. Do you see? So the fact that there's no genealogy, there's no mention mother or father, that's neither here nor there on some orders. But if everybody who's significant in the book does have a genealogy, and now suddenly you don't have any genealogy, and he's even more important than Abram, he's slipped in there, then you have to draw some inferences. And the author is saying, as God has given us this account, there is weight to the fact that there is no father, no mother, no genealogy. As far as the record goes, no beginning of life, no end of days. After all, earlier on, there are lots of beginnings of life and end of days. So-and-so was born, he lived so many years, he produced so-and-so, then he died. So-and-so was born, he lived so many years, produced so-and-so, then he died. So-and-so was born, he lived so many years, produced so-and-so, then he died. Beginning of life and end of days. This chap, he shows up, he disappears. And thus he is like an eternal priest who lives forever. So if you want to hold that this is a pre-incarnate appearance of the eternal Son, I'm not going to enter an argument with you, but I don't think that it's necessary to go down that route. I think what you're seeing is what you often see in the Old Testament, patterns and institutions and people put in place with all kinds of symbol-laden structures around them that are pointing forward, until you come to the reality itself. Now listen further to the exegesis. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now, the law, that is the law of Moses, which comes, after all, more than half a millennium after Abraham. Here, it requires the descendants of Levi, who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their kindred, even though their kindred are descended from Abraham. The Levites, the ultimate grandchildren of Abraham, were authorized by the law, given a millennium, a little less than a millennium, 3/4 of a millennium after Abraham, it authorized them to collect tithes. But this man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi. He was even before Abraham. Yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So all of this argumentation is used to show just how important Melchizedek is. All of that is straightforward exegesis. And then we come to a big jump. This one is huge. When we start talking about how do you preach Christ from the Old Testament, one of the ways into that sort of discussion is start examining how the New Testament quotes the Old. So you start from the back end and see how the New Testament actually quotes the Old. And you discover it does so in a huge diversity of ways, sometimes by analogy, sometimes by direct to prediction, sometimes word association games, sometimes common theological themes and so on, sometimes by something we call typology, that is where there is a pattern, an institution, a person, place, thing that gets repeated and repeated and ratcheted up and repeated and ratcheted up and repeated and ratcheted up until you're taught to expect that there is something bigger that brings it to a climax. And then the fulfillment of that typology is the antitype. And it always ends up with Christ in one fashion or another related to him. But this one's different again. This one's different again. It shows up half a dozen times in the Bible and hinted at in other places. But this way of quoting the Old Testament is spectacularly insightful. I'm going to get at this one through the side door. If you were a conservative first century Jew, and you were asked the question, how do you please God? How would you answer? Oh, by obeying the law. How did Daniel please God? He obeyed the law. How did David please God? He obeyed the law. How did Isaiah please God? He obeyed the law. How did Abraham please God? He obeyed the law. Oh, wait a minute. Abraham didn't have the law. That was before the law. Oh, yes, but Genesis says that he obeyed all my statutes. He must have had a private revelation of the law. He must have. Because it says he obeyed all of God's statutes. How did Enoch please God? Oh, he obeyed the law. No, wait a minute. He was only seventh from Adam. I mean, he doesn't have the law. You don't even have Abraham yet. I mean, that's really desperately anachronistic. Yes, but the text says that he walked with God, and that's common language after the giving of the law for obeying the law. So undoubtedly, Enoch, if he was to please God, he had to obey the law. Do you see? Don't you understand? Now, what are you doing by this kind of reading of the Old Testament? What you're really doing is elevating the law to be the hermeneutical control over the entire text. So now you have taken away the steps of progress in history, and all you've got instead is the law controlling things in an atemporal sort of way. Do you see that? Then you come to the New Testament writers. Paul almost certainly would have interpreted the Old Testament account the way I've just described to you before he became a Christian. But now he's a Christian. And when Paul becomes a Christian, he sees that sequence is important. Reread Galatians 3. The promise came before the law, and the law can't annul the promise. Abraham was justified by faith before the giving of the law. That is a grounding that is established before the law comes. That's a sequential reading of the Old Testament. And first century conservative Palestinian Jews just didn't do that. In other words, the sequence of the account was really important for the apostle to authorize that the gospel saves people by faith. Now, you see something else of the same sort here. Look at the argument in verse 11. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood. Now, skip the next bit. That's a parenthesis. We'll come to it in a moment. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood that came through the law, do you see? Why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? Do you see what the author is saying? If the ultimate priesthood was the Levitical priesthood, and the law of Moses was final, then why on earth is David saying what he's saying centuries after the law was given? You start announcing, oh, it's going to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. You're really saying implicitly that the Levitical priesthood somehow isn't good enough. It's not going to cut it. It's got to be eclipsed. So 1,000 years before Jesus comes, already David's psalm is saying, in effect, we have to have more than a Levitical priesthood. It's not enough. It's an implicit announcement of the need for something that outstrips that priesthood. Then watch how the argument goes. When the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. Go back to that little parenthetical bit that I left out in verse 11. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and the law and the priesthood are so tied together, one establishing the other, that if you take one away, then the other one's gone too. Now, sometimes we think of the law as moral, civil, ceremonial law. That's a common breakdown. It's got all kinds of utilitarian value to it. But what we tend to do with it is to say, and the civil law is not all that important, and the sacrificial law is not all that important. The moral law is the really important thing. And that means we meditate on Exodus 20, because that's the Ten Commandments, and we sort of skim through Leviticus. But this text says, you pull the priesthood out, you've changed the whole law covenant. That whole law covenant is principially obsolete. As soon as you start announcing the obsolescence of the Levitical priesthood, you're announcing the obsolescence of the covenant. That's the very argument that is picked up in chapter 8 of this book. Here you have, in David's time, a structure of thought progress from Abraham, with this vague figure of Melchizedek, then the giving of the law that says you can't have priest and covenant, then David, after that, saying, yeah, but we are going to have a priest who is a priest-king. You can't have priest and king. Now you will have a priest-king in the order of Melchizedek, which makes this one, in principle, obsolete. And now the writer is saying, we do have a priest-king, not from the tribe of Levi. That would be illegitimate. From the tribe of Judah. And that entire old covenant, that law covenant, is already announced as obsolete. A new covenant is already announced in principle 1,000 years before the coming of Jesus.